Good afternoon. Welcome to Book Passages discussion today. My name is Allison Bainbridge, and I am looking forward to our discussion based on the book Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers. Not a light read, but something very important and that I think is really valuable to looking at this huge pandemic that we faced in the last couple of years. Hundreds of thousands of deaths were caused. Actually, we've just reached the milestone recently where it's over 1 million just in the US, were caused not by the vicissitudes of nature, but by the callous and opportunistic decisions of powerful people, as revealed here by author John Nichols. We recently hit that milestone, and I think that although it's 1 million, it could be much worse than that. And on March 10th, 2020, President Donald Trump told the nation, worried about a novel coronavirus, we're prepared and we're doing a great job with it. And it will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away. It's hard not to look back on that and sort of laugh, not out of a comedic laugh, but just how ridiculous it sounds. It has since been estimated that had Trump simply taken the same steps as the other G7 countries, 40% fewer Americans would have died. And it was not just the president. His inner circle, including Mike Pence and Jared Kushner, downplayed the crisis and mishandled the response. Cabinet members, sorry about that, lost something. Cabinet members such as Betsy DeVos and Mike Pompeo undermined public safety at home and abroad to advance their agendas. Senators Ron Johnson and Mitch McConnell, Governors Christie Bradley, all promulgated public policies that led to suffering and death. Meanwhile, profiteer Pfizer and anti-government propagandists such as Grover Norquist fed at the public trough, while the billionaire Jeff Bezos added pandemic profits to a grotesquely bloated fortune. John writes about politics for The Nation as its national affairs correspondent. He is a contributing writer for The Progressive and In These Times, and the associate editor of the Capital Times, the daily newspaper in Madison, Wisconsin, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and dozens of other papers. He's authored several books, including The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, The Genius of Impeachment, The S-Word, Horsemen of the Trump-Apocalypse, A Field Guide to the Most Dangerous People in America, Jews for Buchanan, and Dick Cheney, Dick, the man who is president. We're so fortunate today in conversation with John is Mitch Jeserich. Mitch is an accomplished radio journalist, producer, and anchor who until recently was the news editor for Wake Up Call, the morning show of Pacifica station WBAI in New York, and has recently taken over as the executive producer of KPFA's morning show. As a reminder, if you're interested in joining the discussion by asking questions or making comments, please feel free to use the chat feature and we will get to your questions as we can. I'd like to welcome both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
So, John, I'm here to interview you, and just so I don't anger the current executive director of the KPFA morning show, I am now a host of a program called Letters and Politics. And I'm really excited to be here. And thank you, Allison, for introducing us, because John Nichols has been really sort of an unofficial mentor to me for a long time, for many years. And the great thing we're all going to get from John this hour is John Nichols is a journalist, but he's also a historian. He's a humanist, essayist, and a straight out humanitarian. And he comes at these things that he covers with all of these aspects to him intact. And so we get a very good view, historical and current view of whatever he's writing about. And of course, John, what you're writing about now in Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers is about the pandemic. And you've been writing a great deal about financial and income inequality now for years, long before the pandemic even began. But it seems to me that the pandemic will be a major focal point in the larger telling of this story on financial inequality in the future.
There's simply no question of that, Mitch. And thank you for interviewing me today, and also thanks to Book Passage and everyone for this event. Mitch's show, Letters and Politics, is my favorite radio show. And it is absolutely the one place where we get to go deep on a regular basis. And I hope we'll be able to do some of that today. Mitch, what you raise as regards income inequality is writ large across this pandemic. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write about it. I knew that there would be many books about the pandemic. We haven't even begun to see them. I promise you, there will be books on the shelves at Book Passage 50 years from now, fresh books about this pandemic, because it is going to be like the Great Depression, pick your event throughout history, one of those developments that kind of lingers with us, and generations on, it will have an impact on us emotionally, socially, and politically, of course. But the economic impact is a good place to begin, because it's important to understand that we came into the pandemic unequal. And what the pandemic showed us was that inequality was writ large across our society. There were some people for whom the pandemic was, a vacation, right? They got to stay at home. And if it worked out well, if they had a really nice house in a really nice place, they would go to work casually and, pop their computer on, maybe move some money around and things like that. Their lives in some ways eased. But for the great mass of Americans, their lives became dramatically more perilous and difficult. Nurses had to go into hospitals without sufficient protective gear. Bus drivers had to drive people, buses full of people, some of whom were sick, to get them to those hospitals, to get them to work, to get them to where they needed to be. Immigrant factory workers went into meatpacking plants where there was absolutely inadequate protection, and the disease swept through those plants. Again and again and again, we saw frontline workers put into incredibly difficult positions. And so you saw the reality. The working class, the working poor, put into a more perilous position than they had been in before. The very wealthy getting dramatically better conditions and dramatically richer. And I'll just give you one simple fact. At the start of the pandemic, the United States had 614 billionaires. 18 months in, there were 745 billionaires. That's an exponential increase. It is a very significant jump in the number of billionaires compared to the history of the world when you have that sort of jump in 18 months. But here's the more incredible thing. That small pool of Americans, the Americans who are billionaires, at the start of the pandemic controlled $3 trillion, roughly. 18 months in, they controlled $5 trillion. That's unprecedented. That sort of incredible burst in wealth, that movement of money upward, a redistribution of the wealth to the rich is something that will stand out in the history of this country. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because we need to pause and look at this, and we need to ask ourselves, are there things that we can do to address that redistribution of the wealth itself and all of the pathologies that extend from it?
What was the driver of that dynamic of the inequality, of the distribution of wealth to the top, that big jump you were talking about?
Sure. Look, one of the biggest drivers of it was that many, many wealthy people in America, some of our richest people, deal in the delivery of services, right? We're not as much of a manufacturing country anymore. We are a country that has a service economy. And if you've got a controlling interest in that service economy, you came out very, very well, because we were not in a situation where people could go and pick things up themselves, right? We had things delivered to us. So where do you start to think, oh, Amazon, right? And give you an example, Jeff Bezos came into the pandemic as wealthiest man in the world, or sometimes, depending on, it was he and Elon Musk kind of competing back and forth for wealthiest person in the world. As the pandemic went on, his wealth skyrocketed. It went up by tens of billions of dollars. And you say, well, he's a lucky guy, right? He was on top of something that was beneficial. Well, let's look at it deeper. At the start of the pandemic, Amazon fired whistleblowers in their warehouses who said, look, this isn't safe. People are getting sick. People are going to die here. They didn't say, oh yeah, we've got to take care of this. We've got to, slow this down for a moment and make sure that everybody is protected. They fired people. During the course of the pandemic, they fought, with incredible energy to prevent unionization of their warehouses, even though it's quite clear that unionization is a critical factor in helping to organize for safety in the workplace. And so Amazon didn't just make money by, being in the right place at the right time. It made money by exploiting the circumstance to its benefit. And to give you a final example, just as in the Amazon case, Amazon posted record profits. At the same time, they were announcing that they just recently announced they're increasing their Prime fees, right? So they're posting record profits and they are increasing their costs, right? Their prices for us. We saw that writ large across our business community, the business sector in America. And those who had wealth, those who could easily move money around to get on top of it, to get ahead of it, came out very, very well. I mean, this was a bonanza. It was a time of incredible profiteering. And one thing I'll note, Mitch, is that in writing the book, I did ask the question, well, doesn't this always happen? Isn't this always the case? And the answer to that is no. During World War II, when we had a situation where we were told we were all going to have to share in our sacrifices, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal Democrats, along with a number of Republicans, said, no, that can't happen. And so they established excess profits taxes. And they said, if a company is making more than it made before World War II started, that jump in their profits, that's war profiteering. And so we're going to tax that away from them. And that excess profits tax could go as high as 90%. So they didn't allow it because you're not going to say to a mother, you've got to send your son off to die, at Normandy or at the Battle of the Bulge. But boy, if you're a wealthy millionaire, you can get richer and richer. Similarly, during World War II, they had a 95% top marginal tax on the wealthy. Again, saying, you don't get to get rich out of this situation where people are literally saving rubber and saving cans so that we can, support this war effort. And so if we think about it in that context, what we realize is that our political leaders let us down in the course of this pandemic, because at a time when we could have said, look, shared sacrifice is going to be real, we instead said, no, shared sacrifice is going to be for frontline workers, for essential workers, for nurses and bus drivers and meatpacking plant workers. It's not going to be for the billionaires, and it's not going to be for the CEOs of multinational corporations.
It's a very poignant point, John, because maybe a year and a half ago, and maybe just after the protests that erupted after the killing of George Floyd, there was a lot of thought that maybe times were going to be different, that things were going to be different, that income inequality was on the table, that racial disparities was on the table, and this pandemic was going to be an opportunity for us to examine these things and perhaps to address them. We'll remember being surprised by many of the early pandemic relief bills, and then hopeful in this first year of the Joe Biden presidency of the Build Back Better Act that has never gotten through. So there was a moment we were actually hopeful things were going to be different this time.
In fact, it was a very real possibility. And, I think that's one of the things, if you're a historian or if you write about, major events, one of the things you have to recognize is that you should never fall into the sort of cheap reporting or the easy out of saying, well, it's always going to turn out this way. We often don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how it's going to go. And that's important. That's valuable. That's empowering, because it says, well, we could do it different. We could do it better. And here's the interesting thing, Mitch. At a point when we are told that we are more polarized than at any time in American history, by the way, a bit of a lie. We were probably more polarized in the years before the Civil War. We were also incredibly polarized right before World War II. And so polarization is not, it's not necessarily so much worse today than it has been at sometimes in the past, but it's bad, right? We acknowledge that it's very polarized. And yet in those first weeks of the pandemic, you saw Democrats and Republicans pass $1 trillion spending bills, right? Massive spending bills. And these were things that we were told we could never do, right? There wasn't enough money to do that sort of thing. And B, that we could never unite Democrats and Republicans to do it. But we did it. and a Democratic Congress passed it, a Republican president signed it. And so what you saw was we could leverage the power of government to do a lot of good. That we saw that very clearly. But then very quickly, the sort of deep patterns of American politics and American economics came into play. And here's a fascinating thing. I've got a chapter in the book on Mitch McConnell. The initial passage of pandemic relief, which came in, March, April, right at the start there, very united. But then quickly they realized it wasn't enough. Local governments, which were the front line in helping to provide treatment for people and care for people, they were going broke. Hospitals were on the margins. Rural hospitals were literally overwhelmed. It was clear that they needed more money to flow into this process, right? And so the House of Representatives moved very quickly and passed very easily a major piece of legislation with trillions of dollars to move it out into the system, make it work. And then Mitch McConnell sat on it for a month, for another month, for another month, through the summer, through the fall. Why? Because he said, I'm not going to let this popular bill in this emergency moment pass because it doesn't include a liability shield for multinational corporations that would prevent people from suing them if those corporations failed to protect them, either as consumers or as workers. Effectively, let's say it bluntly, if those corporations let them die or get sick. So Mitch McConnell wanted to protect the corporations. He was literally willing to delay aid for months that was decided to be necessary by Democrats and Republicans over in the House. How many people died because of that? Well, we know, as was mentioned coming into this, that the Lancet study found that in that first year of the pandemic, of the hundreds of thousands of deaths in the United States, roughly 40% were unnecessary when we compare it to other countries. And we can put some of the blame on Donald Trump. We can put some of the blame on his cabinet. We can put blame on governors who failed at the state level. But clearly, a delay in aid at a critical time by Mitch McConnell, that unquestionably led to a massive number of deaths and a more rapid spread of the disease, especially when we had that Delta variant come in, toward the end of 2020. And I apologize, as you moved on further. And so that variant at the end of 2020 was just a surge. But when we start to recognize this, what we know is that people got sick and died who didn't have to get sick and die. And instead of responding with the sense of urgency, focus, and humanity that we knew was possible because we actually organized things in the early stages, we failed. And we failed in part because of politicians like Mitch McConnell.
Did we witness what they call disaster capitalism?
Absolutely.
In fact,
yeah, that's a very good question, Mitch. I wrote about it. I did, as you know, I wrote some about it in the book and talked about Naomi Klein, who, by the way, and to her credit, very early on in the pandemic said, look, be careful. We know how these things tend to turn out. And she warned about it. And that's an important thing because a lot of us knew what we were looking for, right? We knew the possibility. We had gone through the economic meltdown of 2007, 2008. And so she warned about the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism, this notion that in a disastrous moment, capitalists would find ways to make money and the politicians who serve them would find ways to make it easier for them to make money. And that's exactly what happened. In fact, it happened in such clear and such blatant and blunt ways. One of the most profound examples was at the Department of Labor, where Scalia, who is the Secretary of Labor, it was so easy for him to use work rules and OSHA and other tools to protect people immediately, to have provided rapid protections. Similarly, over at the Department of Transportation, Elaine Chao could have easily issued national mask mandates for public transportation in the first days, in the first weeks. In each case, refused to do so. And there is simply no question that tens of thousands of people got sick, hundreds, thousands of people died because of those failures. And those were failures that were done in the interest of industry, in the interest of capitalism, rather than in the interest of humanity.
Going to get to viewer questions here in just a moment, and people can leave questions in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. Before I go to the first one here, John, one last question. Tell me about the pharmaceutical companies in this book.
There's a chapter on Pfizer, and look, one of the things that I learned in writing the book, and that I became more and more aware of, was, of course, that pharmaceutical companies aren't just out to make money. They know how to make money, and they know how to make money easily. And as a result, they don't like pandemics. That's not their thing. They don't like vaccines. That's not their thing either. Because a vaccine is a shot. Maybe you get a couple shots, maybe you get a booster, but it's not every day. If you're a pharmaceutical company, the drugs that you love to make are the drugs that people take every day, right? Because you make a lot more money when you do that. And so the pharmaceutical companies got a lot of incentives to do the vaccines. Early on, they were able to tap into research done by governments to share data, to share DNA globally. And in fact, with Pfizer as an example, they partnered with BioNTech in Europe, and BioNTech got tremendous government support and banking support, public banking support, in order to advance their research. And that's understandable. This was an emergency situation. It was an urgent situation. But what we should recognize is that with all that support, right, then when they produced the vaccines, they got fabulous contracts, sweetheart deals that allowed them to make huge amounts of money at a very, very rapid rate. And Pfizer stood out because they had opted out of some of the limits on profiteering. And so in the case of Pfizer, they have made, it was announced just recently that in 2021, when the vaccines came online, they doubled their revenues. Now you think about that, an established multinational corporation that doubles its revenues in 1 year. That's an amazing thing. And then within that doubling, understand $20 billion of their profits, of their advance of revenues, came from the vaccines. Now here's the interesting thing. Oxfam estimates that Pfizer has been making $1 million an hour, every hour, night and day, since they brought the vaccines online. That is an incredible amount of money. Pfizer, Moderna, and BioNTech, not talking profits here, but talking revenues, right? Their revenues reached a rate of combined $1,000 a second, $65,000 a minute, $93 million a day, every single day since they brought those vaccines online. Now, say, wow, they lucked out, man. They're making the big money. But here's the interesting thing. When you came to them, especially Pfizer, and said, well, hey, we've got the most vulnerable people in the world who aren't being vaccinated. There are places around the world where nurses and doctors don't have vaccines. Can't we share your technology? Can't we share your formulas here to make sure that we can vaccinate the world at a time when we've got a global pandemic where the disease actually does, move across borders, moves around the world very easily? And Pfizer's answer was, are you kidding? Of course not, right? They have refused to do that basic step. And so here you have a situation where a company is doubling its revenues, posting unimaginable profits, and yet refusing to do baseline shared sacrifice. And that's the term I keep coming back to. We said to working class and poor people, you must engage in shared sacrifice. We have not said to the pharmaceutical companies that shared sacrifice must also apply to you.
Let's go to our first question. The book talks about the failure of Project Airbridge, run by Jared Kushner. Were laws broken? What were they specifically? And has there been no prosecution? Who can people contact to demand it?
Great question. And it takes us into Jared Kushner. And we should explain, Mitch, that the book has 18 chapters in it. I write about individuals and companies with an idea of explaining their role in making our response to this pandemic more difficult. And there is a chapter on Jared Kushner, just as there are chapters on some of the other people we've discussed, Betsy DeVos and Eugene Scalia and others. as well as Donald Trump, but also some Democrats like Andrew Cuomo and Rahm Emanuel. So we've got a lot of bad players that we look at. One of the worst players was Jared Kushner. And here's the interesting thing. Jared Kushner, as some people are aware, pretty much everything he's ever touched fell apart. There's not a lot of evidence that he's particularly good at what he does. That was true in the real estate industry. That's been true in a lot of other things. But he married well. And as a result, he was put in a position where he was close to power. And because Donald Trump came to the presidency as someone who was not experienced in politics, who didn't know a lot of political players and didn't trust a lot of political players, again and again in the White House, he gave responsibility to Jared Kushner. And Jared Kushner at different points was in charge of Middle East peace, dealing with the opioid epidemic, dealing with border issues, you just run down the list. Kushner, whenever there was something that Trump knew was important and knew that he had to suggest that he was interested in, that he was concerned about, he would give it to Jared Kushner. So in the spring of 2020, Donald Trump had a problem. He had lied about the pandemic. He had denied its seriousness and then bragged about that to Bob Woodward in one of the most craven acts of any president in American history. And now it's coming back to haunt him because we saw the images from New York of people dying, of refrigerated trucks to keep the bodies. This is horrible, horrible stuff. And one of the images that came out of New York was nurses who were using garbage bags to protect themselves because they didn't have adequate protective gear. So Donald Trump said, well, we're going to get that gear. And he put Jared Kushner in charge of the supply chain. And Jared Kushner consulted with a college roommate, right? Not with experts, but with a college roommate, and established something called Project Airbridge. And Project Airbridge was a classic crony capitalist scheme where you literally took US resources, US transportation tools, and you said to multinational corporations, you can import goods, protective gear from other countries. We will basically remove your risk. We'll make it possible for you to import it without any hassle, without any challenges. We'll give you economic benefits to do it. And the only reason we're doing this is because then you'll bring this gear here faster because the private sector can do things better than the public sector. This is the theory, right? The fantasy. Well, what they didn't do was tell these companies that they had to get that gear to where it was needed. So when the gear came in, many of the companies started selling it to the highest bidder. And the end result was that massive amounts of gear that could have gone to save lives instead went to places that already were pretty well protected and just were building up more. And so Project Airbridge turned into, again, the classic crony capitalist scheme. And it, screwed up the supply chain. Some of those screw-ups continue to haunt us to this day. But B, it ended up moving resources at a very difficult time to multinational corporations that frankly didn't need it. They weren't sometimes even very good at what they were doing. And it was investigated, as the questioner raises the issue. It was investigated very quickly by Congress. Kushner finally just sort of abandoned this and ran away from it because it had turned into such a disaster. There has not been criminal prosecution on this. But I would argue that if we had the level of investigation that is necessary, that it's very possible that you could find examples of the use of government power to benefit individual corporations and to benefit individual allies of the president in ways that were not just inappropriate but illegal. It's certainly appropriate. This is a far more legitimate investigation than most investigations that our federal government engages in, and it has not been investigated. The interesting thing, Mitch, is that we cracked down and arrested people who were price gouging, or at least we charge crimes of people who were price gouging on the street level, right? Some states were pretty strict about that, but we haven't cracked down on the people who engaged in the most severe price gouging, which does indeed contravene laws of this country and also opens up areas for civil action and areas for congressional action. What's troubling to me, Mitch, is that now, 2 years into this crisis, we still have seen remarkably little criminal, civil, or congressional action to hold people to account. And Jared Kushner would be on that list along with the people that he enriched.
Well, Allison asks, what is the likelihood that any of these people will be prosecuted?
Allison, it's up to you. That's why I wrote the book. And, it's very easy. As I've been touring around talking about this book, I've been in a lot of settings and I asked a lot of questions about it. And that question, some variation of it comes up because there's a lot of sense in America that we live in an age of impunity, that nobody gets held to account for any wrongdoing in which they engage. And, there's a lot of evidence of it. Richard Nixon didn't get prosecuted or held to account for Watergate. He got on a plane and fled to San Clemente, where he started rehabilitating his reputation. Ronald Reagan didn't get charged with any crimes as regards Iran-Contra. He flew back to California too. Bush and Cheney, they weren't held to account for lies about the war in Iraq or for policies that crashed the global economy. Neither was Bill Clinton for policies that undermine banking regulation. And so, we see people walk away from immense amounts of wrongdoing. And so you can begin to think that nobody can ever be held to account. But the fact is, and in my closing chapter in the book, I write a lot about this, there have been cases where it has happened. And one of the classic examples was back during the Great Depression. In 1932, when the Depression was really raging, it was the point at which Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, a U.S. Senate committee started investigating, why was it so much worse? Why was America suffering? It's a different crisis, but a similar concern that there was a global problem, but it seemed that America was hit especially hard and a lot of overwhelming things were happening. And they asked this question: was this because bankers and wealthy financial interests profiteered and took advantage of an economic bad turn to benefit themselves and their allies, and not to take care of or not to serve the overall economy or the overall humanity of the country? And they hired a guy who had prosecuted mobsters and petty crooks in New York City, a guy named Ferdinand Thecora. He was born in Sicily and an immigrant, brilliant lawyer. And they brought him down to Washington. They paid him an incredibly small salary, a couple $100 a month. And they said, take a look at these guys. He, over a matter of a couple of months, produced so much information that effectively they began to refer to him as the Hellhound of Wall Street. And he wrote a book that was, it was like Wall Street Under Oath. It was an incredible thing. They brought the bankers in, they brought the government people in, they questioned them, they grilled them under oath. And out of those inquiries, you had criminal prosecutions, you had civil actions, you had fines, and most importantly, Allison and Mitch, you had congressional action. Again and again, when you do accountability, when you prosecute, when you act civilly or you act in the congressional level, when you do accountability, it drives change. And that's the most important thing. In my book, I say again and again, be careful about assuming that you just want to punish an individual. That's the cheap, easy way out. It's like, oh, we don't like Trump, so let's go after him and hold him to account. I believe in holding him to account. There's no question of that. Jared Kushner as well, and Andrew Cuomo as well. But more importantly is that in holding individuals to account or corporations to account, we begin to recognize the systemic problems. And that's where you change laws. That's where you regulate. That's where you tax in different ways. And if you look back at the evidence of the Thecora Commission, which I have pretty much a chapter on in my book, the fact of the matter is it worked. It was very, very effective in changing behaviors in the financial industry and also in changing the laws of the country. So the answer, Allison, is that we can do it, but we have to demand it. And at this point, we're talking at a point when horrible things are happening in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when there are all sorts of things happening domestically with inflation, and frankly, when there's a lot of people who are just sick and tired of the pandemic, right? They're ready to move on to the next thing. Well, my warning is that if we move on to the next thing without accountability, without prosecution, without change, we virtually guarantee that the next crisis that comes will be worse, that we will face more profiteering, more criminal activity, more wrongdoing, because we didn't stop to prosecute now.
Is inflation part of the story that you're telling?
100%. Absolutely, no question that inflation is not just a part of it; it's a huge part of it, Mitch. And look, one of the things we need to understand is that the pandemic told corporations, it told the wealthy and the powerful that Americans can very quickly restructure their behaviors, right? Because of a health threat or an economic threat, they can change things quickly and learn new ways to get their products, to get their goods. They can also learn to pay more for things. And the fact of the matter is, how many people who used to go out to dinner or go out to buy their own stuff started ordering it in, right? Having it delivered to their house. Well, there becomes a whole new system, right? And new costs, new expenses. And people say, well, this is just a part of living, right? I'm going to have to do this. Well, that had a profound impact on corporations. And so just as human beings were transformed by the pandemic, and we talk about mental health issues, we talk about all sorts of other issues, we talk about the Great Resignation where people are changing their work life, corporations changed as well. And one of the things that they figured out was that they could blatantly announce that they had doubled their profits or that they had exponentially increased their earnings, that they had, in fact, that they were posting record profits, and on the same day announced that they're raising prices. Now, you understand, historically, somebody at a company would have said, oh, hold it. That's going to look pretty bad. Let's not announce that we're making more money than we ever have before and then tell people we're going to raise the profits. And yet, in working on the book and then more recently in some articles that I've done following up on it, I can point you to headline after headline in the financial press where they literally announce their earnings and say, these are record earnings, record profits, and say, and by the way, we're raising prices. Kellogg's did that. Amazon has done it, raising record profits, raising prime. And, the oil industry, the fossil fuel industries are doing it like crazy. In fact, with what's happening in Europe right now, they are very likely to do even more. And so, yes, inflation is profoundly a part of this. And yet, Mitch, the problem is that our political class, and this includes Democrats, very uncomfortable using the word profiteering. They shy away from it. They're cautious because they do think of it as an indicting word, as a charging word, like you're charging someone with wrongdoing. Well, yes, it is, and we should use it as such, but we don't, and it's problematic.
That's interesting because you were talking about the 1950s and efforts to keep war profiteering from happening. This is when we have the tax rate at 91%. This is when we have a Republican president, former General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Did they use the word comfortably in the 50s, profiteering?
In the 50s, it was starting to fade some. They used it very much in the 30s and the 40s. There's no question that war profiteering became, after World War I, a hugely common word, hugely common term in our language. In fact, it was so powerful that I would suggest to you that we actually had a president become president because of the term, and that's Harry Truman. In the 1940s, Harry Truman was sent out to investigate defense industries and to look at whether they were taking advantage of the circumstance. And the Truman Report, which came out, I believe, in 43, played a critical role in positioning him to be chosen to be vice president in 44. It actually raised his prominence, and frankly, it gave him a very good reputation because he was a guy who had talked about profiteering and talked about irresponsible business practices. So there was clearly a time when it was a big deal. And also, Mitch, I will tell you that related to your question, in the Eisenhower era, in the 50s, there was clearly a much deeper discussion of business responsibility and of government's responsibility to decide how business operated. Eisenhower gave his classic Cross of Gold speech, which was about the cost of funding the military at the expense of domestic needs. This was 8 years before he delivered the speech on the military-industrial complex. And so we had leaders, Democrats and Republicans, who were willing to talk in this language. And it was a language of accountability. It was a language of responsibility. And people got very comfortable with it. Remember, as you point out, in the 50s, this is a non-war era, except for the Korean War at the start of it. It was the Cold War era, but this was a different era than World War II. And yet we maintained a 91%, 92% at sometimes top marginal tax rate for the wealthy. How were we able to do that? Because our leaders were willing to say, hey, it does not make sense for them to be making this kind of money when there are still people who are struggling. And that balance, we seem to have lost it along the way. You'll hear a Jesse Jackson talk about it. You'll hear a Bernie Sanders talk about it. You'll hear now Ilhan Omar or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talk about it. But at the top level of politics, you don't hear a Joe Biden, let alone a Donald Trump, or a Chuck Schumer, let alone a Mitch McConnell, talk about profiteering. And if we had more talk about it, I can promise you there'd be a lot less of it. Just the talk itself is powerful.
I want to follow up with the Thecora Commission then, because when you were talking about it and what it did, and again, called it a commission, I was just thinking about how difficult it has been to get any kind of commission today. We think about how they try to get the January 6th commission created, but they couldn't get that necessarily through Congress. They had to do a special congressional committee to work on that. The difficulty of now getting an independent commission. Was it all difficult? Was the Thecora Commission an independent commission? And was that at all difficult to get?
No, they did it the right way. And this is one of the things that I talk about a lot. I talk about some of the book. I've talked about it, I think probably a few times with you, Mitch. I'm not a fan of independent commissions. I'm not a fan of special prosecutors. I think the system of checks and balances works best when Congress itself investigates, right? And when you have a committee like the Fulbright Committee back in the late 60s that investigated issues as regards Vietnam War, or Gaylord Nelson's Food and Drug Committee, which had a 9-year investigation of drug prices. You know, an open-ended, ongoing investigation of drug prices that had a profound impact on the pharmaceutical industries and others in that period before they finally wound it up. And so the fact is there is a congressional committee now that is looking at some of the pandemic issues. Jim Clyburn is in charge of it, and they've done some good work. I give them credit, but they've had no profile, right? They most people don't even, when I say it exists, most people don't even know it exists. And it's frankly been relatively tepid in its approach. It's very different than Thecora. The fascinating thing about Thecora is that he was hired on by bipartisan Republicans and Democrats, and they were scared for their hides, to be honest. The reality of the Great Depression was that people were angry. They were voting everybody out. And so this key committee in the Senate decided, well, we better get on top of this. And there were Republicans who were in the forefront of this, saying, yeah, it looks, people are voting Republicans out. Maybe we want to be good on these issues. Maybe we want to get ahead of it. So they brought Thecora in. They gave him immense power. They basically said, we'll give you the forum of our committee room, but we're going to have you here, much like in the impeachment trials where they would bring in lawyers to help to do the prosecution. They brought Thecora in, and they basically let him loose on these bankers. It was an incredible thing. And Mitch, it was the hottest story in town. It was covered on the front pages. It was on radio. I mean, this was such a huge story that the whole country was talking about it and thinking about it. And let me tell you something. If we had a similar moment in this country where we said, we've just been through 2 years of hell, let's take a look at who made it worse. Let's investigate that. And if that was done with the sort of aggressive, focused prosecutorial approach using the platform of Congress, I think it could change everything in this country. Now, will we get it? We'll only get it if people demand it. That's the bottom line. The political classes in both parties tend to be a little resistant to it. But I can tell you, if the Democrats were smart, they would do this, because the fact of the matter is that the narrative of the pandemic keeps getting rewritten. And already you see political players sort of writing the Republicans out of a place of responsibility and writing the Democrats into being responsible, right? And so accountability serves to keep the historical record straight. And frankly, just for purely partisan motives, I would think the Democrats would be far more aggressive in this regard, but they have not. At this point, we have not seen the level of accountability that we should.
John, we got about 15 minutes left. If people want to get their questions in, they can do so by just putting it right into the chat box, and we'll see it and we'll try to get to it as long as time permits. I do want to ask you about the public health policy debates that were occurring, and one specifically that you write about, and that is the debate over a federal mask mandate during the Trump administration. Tell me about that story.
Well, run that story. As I mentioned to you before, each of the chapters in the book tends to deal with an individual. And that story is told in the chapter on Elaine Chao, who is Mitch McConnell's wife. But, that's a little unfair to her. She's actually a veteran cabinet member. I mean, she's been around. She's very, very experienced. She's a pro.
Former labor secretary under the Bush administration.
But she's been in every Republican administration going back to Reagan. I mean, she's got a real history of engagement with Republican administrations. And here's the interesting thing. She's always done the same thing. She's always protected the industry she's supposed to regulate. No matter what cabinet position or regulatory position she's in, that's what she's done. So as Secretary of Labor or Secretary of Transportation, she was in a position to issue a national mask mandate, and certainly could have done it on a number of levels. First off, for public transportation in general, particularly interstate commerce, transportation across state lines, stuff like that. There's a lot of room to do this. And frankly, in the critical early days of the pandemic, she wouldn't have had a problem. It would have been something that was welcomed and encouraged. Instead, she refused to do so. And in each of the chapters in the book, I try to tell the story of an individual who, warned about it, who knew that the danger was there, and then wasn't protected and ended up getting sick and dying. The chapter on Elaine Chao, I read about a guy named Scott Ryan, who was a bus driver up in the Seattle area. And he, in February of 2020, was saying, these buses are unsafe. We need mandates. We need protection. And it didn't happen. The unions begged for it. They begged for it for a year, and she wouldn't do it. And the fact is, there is simply no question. I've got the figures in the book. Thousands of people died. Just the employees themselves, the workers, the exponential numbers more of undoubtedly passengers and others. I mean, this was just rank irresponsibility and cruelty at a fundamental level, because people were begging her to do this. And there's one other section on the mask mandate I'll tell you very quickly, that it also comes up in the chapter on Mark Meadows, who was chief of staff. And one of the most fascinating things that I learned in writing the book was there was a brief moment where it looked like Donald Trump himself was going to issue a national mask mandate. They brought his pollster in, they brought other people into the White House. And these folks said, look, if you issue it, Republicans will respect it. They'll do it. And it could have a huge role in, stalling the spread of this disease. It could be a critical intervention. And Trump kind of got interested in that. He was open to it. And then Mark Meadows and a couple other key players in the White House, Stephen Miller as an example, they said, no, we can't do that. That would go against our brand. Our brand is that we're tough and we don't bend to these sorts of things. We're building out this message of we're not going to defer to it. We're for freedom and stuff like that. So we saw the beginnings of a lot of where we ended up on this thing. And so as a result, Trump didn't do it. And the fact of the matter is there's simply no question that Mark Meadows bears personal responsibility for having prevented a mask mandate at a time when we very likely would have gotten it.
Could that be under investigation in the future if you got such a commission that you've been seeking, as to how not just the profiteering aspect, but how the administrations and government officials responded? Because you also write this, it's not just the federal level. You also get this very similar dynamic, a game of politics happening at the state and local level too.
Absolutely. There's simply no question. There's judges as well who did terrible rulings, right? And yes, of course you can investigate it, Mitch. Now, some things, again, I always talk about 3 levels of accountability and their baseline, and that's criminal, civil, and congressional. And it might be that, could you charge Mark Meadows with a crime? I'm not sure you could, but could identifying what Mark Meadows did, could it potentially lead to civil action? Possibly. Could it lead to congressional action? Absolutely. Of course it could. And that's the key thing here. We don't think about accountability in the right way in this country. We're too casual about it. There are many forms of accountability that are effective and powerful. An excess profits tax is a form of accountability. A tax on billionaires is a form of accountability. Regulation of corporations is a form of accountability. And obviously, criminal and civil actions are. When we start to think about it that way, yes, these inquiries could get to a Mark Meadows, I think, very quickly. And maybe they would do something that I do talk about in the book a lot in the final chapter, which is that maybe they would simply say that we identify these people as folks that we will never give power to again. And that's I write in the book about the experience of Michael Foote and the British journalists who wrote the book Guilty Men at the start of World War II. They identified the appeasers of Hitler at the start of World War II, and they ruined their political careers simply by writing that book. And so sometimes we do accountability solely to say that this person who did so much harm should never be in a position of power again. And if we do it well enough, they won't be.
Question from Michael. Trump and his campaign staff intentionally ignored public health laws and spread COVID through the rallies. Could you talk about how to hold them accountable?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's where you end up with the possibility of civil action, right? I mean, literally, if you got sick in a circumstance where it was clear that people, for reasons of politics or for reasons of self-interest, didn't do the basics on it. There's a lot of places where you could intervene there. But again, I go to this example of holding people to account. One of the worst players was Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. Now, he was a bad player on the international stage. We can go on for hours about that. But he actually tried to force State Department personnel's families to come to Christmas parties during a pandemic spike, right? I mean, it was just incredibly irresponsible. And basically, everybody was begging him not to do this. They were saying, this is a terrible idea. The Washington Post was writing about it. Congressional committees were saying, hey, it's a bad idea. And yet he pursued it. And in part, he did it because he enjoyed it. It made him happy, right, to do these things. It made him feel prominent and good and whatever. And the fact of the matter is, if we expose people who are willing to get, families of State Department personnel, children sick, because they want to create this fantasy of normalcy in a time of crisis, I think it raises a very good question, and I'll certainly remember to write about it if Mike Pompeo decides to run for president in 2024. And that's one of the things that we should be conscious of. Part of why I wrote the book is that so we have a permanent record that we can go back to and say, look, this is somebody you don't want to give power to.
Ed asks if you have any thoughts on Boris Johnson.
The guy's incompetent. I mean, it's just like jaw-dropping. I mean, I won't go. We don't have enough time, Mitch, to go through it. But actually, I've thought a lot about Boris Johnson. And, Boris Johnson, because of the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, could have provided the best example for the United States, right? It was one of those situations where, we often do look to the United Kingdom for examples of how to do things right. It's certainly not uncommon. Reagan looked at Thatcher. There's no doubt of that. And frankly, George Bush looked to Tony Blair for help during the Iraq War. And so Johnson becomes a significant factor. I mentioned him some. And the thing about it is just like Trump, he played politics with the crisis. And he and his staff, as we now know, did not take seriously the rules that they tried to apply to other people. And so at the same time, they were telling people they couldn't visit dying loved ones at the hospital, they were having parties at 10 Downing Street. And you see parallel stories throughout the Trump administration as well.
Dealing with a pandemic has been new for us in the United States, not for other places in the world. And I think in some ways we could look at those places and see that they were more efficient and handled things in a more mature way than we have. But again, for us, this was our first pandemic in all of our lifetime. In
our lifetimes, yeah. Although,
we shouldn't forget about HIV/AIDS, obviously.
Well, HIV/AIDS, which was a very real and very real right. kind of, it reached for many communities, but also for society, much of a pandemic kind of moment. And then I can tell you also just quickly, and I know you're leading to a much better question on this, that my mother is 91 years old, and I called her early on and said, what do you think about this? Yeah, I've been through it before. And I said, what do you mean? And she was talking about scarlet fever pandemics in rural Wisconsin in the 1930s. And so we have had small targeted ones, but what this pandemic was universal, right? It was everywhere. And one other thing, Mitch, it came at a time when we know so much more about how to deal with it, right? It should have been different.
Because that was just less than 2 decades after the Spanish flu. So I guess that's my next question. In writing and investigating in all of this, do you think we're better prepared for the next time, or maybe even the next variant?
Absolutely not. I hate to say it. I desperately wish I could say that we are better prepared. The fact of the matter is we have learned a lot. You and I may be better prepared. Everyone who's tuned in to this is probably better prepared because they have been through it, and there's wisdom that comes from that. Certainly some states, some cities are dramatically better prepared. And we know we have models and approaches to do it. But the best preparation of all, Mitch, is to have a planning, right? Industrial policy and planning that makes sure that you don't offshore the industries that create protective gear. We don't have that. And our trade policies militate against it. The best preparation is to have a single-payer Medicare for all healthcare system that guarantees people healthcare in a preventative as well as a care model. We don't have that, and we're not moving particularly rapidly toward that. I can run down the list of things that we should have come out of this pandemic and immediately moved to. We haven't done it yet. And so I guess when I come full circle on this, when we talk about accountability is, as I say, criminal, civil, and congressional. But the ultimate accountability comes in the form of societal change. It comes in the form of making the changes that assure that if we ever get hit with something like this again, that we're prepared to deal with it. And also that we extend from it intellectually and practically and say, wow, the pandemic has taught us that we can do big things. We can respond in big ways. Shouldn't we be thinking about climate in that way right now? And the fact of the matter is, I fear to say that there's a lot of evidence we have yet to make the leap. So I write the book to plead with people to take seriously the issue of accountability, not because they're mad at Trump or something like that, but because they want to make sure that their children and grandchildren live in a better world.
I'm smiling because I've talked to you many times over the years, and as we're moving here towards to wrap up, I'll end with this. My question is then: is it too late to make that transition? And this is where you and I usually seem to part a little bit, because you're always far more optimistic than I am about things in the future.
Yeah, there's no point in writing this book. As you know, Mitch, I'm kind of a busy guy, doing a lot of stuff, and I've been very, very blessed to have the opportunity to write books on a lot of different topics. And to come to Book Passage and to talk about them over the years with great crowds and wonderful people. And so when I choose to write about something, I choose to write about it because I believe that doing so can have an impact. And it's interesting that my friend Rebecca Solnit, who has obviously read and done a lot with folks in the Bay Area, she and I joke about the fact that we've kind of taken possession of the word hope. She owns the word hope. I just rent it now and again. But the fact of the matter is that you write because you believe that if you hit the right mark, if you get to a certain point of revelation and understanding, that it can make the change. That I'm not going to make the change myself, but that the people who read something, who learn something, they will say, you know what, I'm going to go out and work on this thing. I'm going to believe it is possible to change the course of a city, a state, a nation, the world. And the truth of the matter is that I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful. And there's a big difference between optimism, which says, oh yeah, everything's going to turn out fine, and hope, which is that I hope that as a country we can learn that from the pandemic and from the moment we've been through, that it is possible to do great things with government and to make government serve humanity in profound and transformational ways. And that if we just decide to have government that actually works for people rather than multinational corporations and political aspirations, we might find that we can very quickly solve a lot of our problems, including many of the problems that the pandemic exposed.
Again, the name of the book is Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers: Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. It is now out. John Nichols, thank you for that. That was wildly informational. So thank you. And we're going to now turn it back to Allison.
Well, thank you both so much. This was an absolutely stimulating conversation. It definitely made me think about things in sort of a different way in talking about accountability and our individual roles. So thanks again, you guys. We really appreciate it. And thank you to our audience for tuning in today. If you'd like to purchase the book, which I encourage you to do so, we have them available at Book Passage. You can order it online. You can call us. You can come into our stores, which are open at the Ferry Building and in Corte Madera. Everybody stay safe and hopeful, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us, Allison.
You're welcome.
Thank you.